Hey guys, Paul here. So today I wanted to talk about power creep in Yu-Gi-Oh! And more specifically, some of the subtle nuances and differences that I've sort of seen Konami implementing into Yu-Gi-Oh! In recent years. So obviously power creep is a bit of a contentious topic, but it's something that exists in many different competitive games, right? The new things kind of got to be a little bit better than the old thing so that you'll buy the new hero, the new character, the new card, product, whatever, and to that end they have to make it better than the thing that came before it. And Yu-Gi-Oh is no secret to power creep. You could make an easy example and compare like Cyber Dragon to something like Dino Wrestler Pankratops and then eventually Kashtira Fenrir. Very similar archetype of card, powerful thing that summons itself as like a special summon, and they've added more and more effects and more like use better stats, things like that, right? So typically in Yu-Gi-Oh, whenever there's like power creep, it's sometimes like very obvious. Like a new deck will come out that's just clearly better than everything around it. That happened with Dragon Rulers, it happened with Zodiacs, Necros. There are plenty of examples of that where just power creep takes over in a big way and everybody kind of knows it. But other times it's a little bit more subtle, and sometimes it kind of just happens like gradually over time. And sometimes it's not a simple matter of like a single deck that's just better than everything, but rather a card design philosophy that you notice. So I'm gonna quit talking and babbling in riddles, and I'll just get to the point. I've got this list I'm gonna be sort of following here, but there are basically five or so. This might end up being six. I'm kind of just talking off the dome here. Ways that I've noticed like power creep setting in Yu-Gi-Oh recently. So the first really big one is the Poplar, and this one's pretty well documented. Everybody's kind of been talking about it. Snake Eyes Poplar, right? This is a card that kind of does a little bit of everything. If it's added to your hand, it summons itself. And that's really a very huge deal, right? We've got plenty of search cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! We've got plenty of monsters that can like sort of special summon themselves from the hand if you have another thing on the field or something like that. But Poplar is kind of new in that like if you use Bonfire to search it, then it's added to your hand, it summons itself. If you use Snake Eye Ash to search it, it summons itself. Even if it gets added to your hand from like the graveyard or the banish zone, it can summon itself. And that's sort of like taking a small kind of step out of the equation of getting this monster to the field. When it gets to the field, whether it's normal summoned or special summoned by its own effect or otherwise, then you get a search, right? This is something we've seen for years, right? Like, Stratos. Every deck kind of wants to have a Stratos, something that just sort of starts the plays when it gets summoned. But the difference with Poplar is that you can search Poplar, it summons itself, and then it gets a card. So imagine if when you use Rhoda or E-Call to search the Stratos to your hand, it's just already on the field. And then when Poplar leaves, it also gets a floaty effect. In this case, it's going to come back as a continuous spell, which is obviously a really big boon for the Snake Eye strategy for a bunch of reasons. But yeah. Now, Poplar is sort of unique at the time, but like every deck is actually getting like a Poplar. And by every deck, I mean like, new and upcoming decks are kind of getting that. There is that new Draco card that you can use in the Tenpai deck that just like when it's added to your hand can summon itself and then does something. Also, the new Tachyon support cards that are going to be coming out soon, that they're like the light legendary duelist set. There's also like a Poplar like that in that deck. When it's added to your hand, you can summon it. When it's summoned, it does this, that, and the other. And when it goes to the graveyard, it can attach itself as material and like kind of repeat the process, come back to the hand, all that. So basically, you see this more and more in different archetypes. Oh, I forgot also the shark water support that's coming in like Rise of the Abyss later in the year. There's also like a Poplar like card there. So this whole Poplar thing seems to be just a new way of Konami making cards that really are like self-starters in a way. We already talked about it, like Snake Eye Ash kind of does everything for the Snake Eye deck, but it's definitely empowered a bit by Poplar and that sort of relationship that they've got. I'll get into this a little bit more later, but the fact that these cards have like this many different effects also kind of means that when they are used in the opponent's turn, you can effectively like double the amount of effects you get, and that's like a whole thing. But I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Okay, so the next thing is the quick play search spell. So what comes to mind here is a card like Wanted Seeker of Sinful Spoils. You might be thinking initially, okay, well, making a Rhoda sort of search spell be a quick play doesn't really change very much, right? Konami's actually even been doing this for several years now. They'll typically make the quick play search spell like a neg 1 or something. Like you have to discard a card first maybe to get it. But obviously Wanted Seeker Sinful Spoils does not have that. Same with the Tenpai search spell. It's like a quick play spell. And there's a few subtle advantages to this. The first one being that you can activate quick play spells in chains. So you can chain them to many different things, right? You could chain it to, your opponent flipping up some card that would stop you from searching or something like that. But more importantly, you can activate these in like any phase of the game. So you can use Wanted during the draw phase or the standby phase, and if you do, your opponent won't be able to use Draw and Lockbird on you afterwards, even though you added a card from deck to hand, because Draw and Lockbird can only be used in the main phase. So it's kind of a way to skate and dodge around a hand trap. I'm going to be getting a little bit more into that in a second with a later point. But yeah, so obviously that's a really big benefit. It also means, though, that you're now able to search during your opponent's turn. And that's a really big deal because it's like, okay, I can use my wanted this turn and get a search. And say I have two wanteds and I got a hard once per turn. Well, that sucks. I can't use both in one turn. What am I supposed to do? Easy. You set one, and then you can use it during your opponent's turn in their end phase or whenever they try to pop it with a spell or trap, and then you get a search anyway. So obviously, the quick play spell search card seemed innocuous on the surface, but actually opens up a whole new possibility of like things that you can use during both turns, ways that you can generate more advantage. It's more interactable, chainable, that whole thing. So next thing is the point that I've kind of been alluding to with a lot of this, playing on the opponent's turn. Now, when a lot of people hear this, they think of, kind of the turn zero cards like, what is it, Tearlament's Havness, the one that like summons itself from the hand during the opponent, whenever the opponent activates an effect. I forget which one, but you guys know. And there are plenty of cards that have this. There are things like, Melfi that do it kind of in an innocuous way that's not too bad. But then you've got things like Fluanderies and Rescue Ace have a way of playing in the opponent's turn. Obviously, things like Poplar can technically even start combos in the opponent's turn if it gets added to your hand somehow. Just these card effects that sort of summon themselves somehow during the opponent's turn and then begin actually activating more effects, right? Things that will start like milling cards. Tearlament Sheeran is what I was thinking of. But yeah, they'll start milling cards and then triggering summons and triggering effects, and it all happens in your opponent's turn. And some people really don't like those, hour turn decks, but that's sort of become the norm in Yu-Gi-Oh! These days because going second sort of sucks. And if you can have a way to start playing in your opponent's first turn, that's obviously very good. This can be really overwhelming though, because it can sort of mean that decks get like 2 turns to play. And that's sort of the second part of it that I wanted to bring up, is that like, with a card like Wanted, like I said, Wanted can be used in my turn and it can be used in your turn. And I can get like 2 searches off of cards like Wanted if I happen to have like a dead copy or whatever. And same with Poplar, I can get all 3 of its effects in my turn, but I also could get all 3 of its effects in your turn. And once I'm doing that, I'm generating so much advantage and kind of reusing effects that are otherwise like hard once per turns, but like I'm literally getting them in both turns. And you see where like that starts to get extremely, extremely strong. And, playing in your turn, it's technically not new. There've always been like monsters that kind of have like negation effects. If you think about, any of the Omni negate monsters that we know and love, like an Apollosa or whatever, yeah, they can do that. But this is sort of different because it's like you're getting play starters, combo starters, and potential disruptions just out of your hand activating in your opponent's turn. There's Bestials. There's so many different examples. And again, not saying this is like a bad thing. I think that with Yu-Gi-Oh, like I said, going first sort of is overpowered. So if you go second, then you can use these cards to, I guess, like fight back. But it can certainly feel rough if like if you like are playing an older deck that does not have a card that like summons itself in the opponent's turn or interrupts them somehow in the opponent's turn, like in engine, then yeah, that kind of isn't very fun, right? Okay. The next thing is the hyper-recursion effect, where basically this is you can start to notice this all sort of melds together, but I guess that's the point of this sort of video, is how like Konami's doing it all, right? The hyper-recursion for me is just basically, I look at how archetypes nowadays just recur a lot of resources, sometimes like in the end phase of the turn. So an easy example here would maybe be something like Branded, where a lot of their monsters, spells, traps, they just add themselves back to your hand during the end phase if like you sent a fusion monster to your grave that turn, which obviously you're going to do. And in some cases they even add themselves back during your opponent's end phase. So like sometimes it's like, oh, it only happens in yours, other times it's in your opponent's. And basically being able to sort of play out a combo, play out a turn, and then at the end of the turn get 2, 3, 4 cards back to your hand to start playing again next turn, or even maybe in your opponent's turn, is really pretty crazy because a lot of old decks simply don't have that. There are plenty of old existing decks that have like good sort of resource accumulation engines, but only really the newer decks released in the last few years tend to get the ability to quite literally like regain those resources in your turn. Another thing too that's sort of related is I've noticed an uptick in the amount of cards that get some sort of an effect when your opponent summons something. So this is sort of like your Branded Regain, your Divine Temple of the Snake Eyes, even maybe your like Tearlament Scream, just these different cards where it's like, oh, if your opponent summons something, then you begin to like get more stuff as well. You get to summon a bestial monster from your grave. You summon back the Magnamute, now it activates its search effect. You summon the Flamberg Dragon from like your spell and trap zone, and now that's like a threat for your opponent to deal with. You get some sort of a benefit. You start milling, or you start searching, or you just get something back, and that's just literally when your opponent tries to play in their own turn, you will be amassing advantage that way. And that's in addition to whatever other benefits that maybe like a Branded Regained has, like, getting this latent draw every turn and stuff like that. So I've noticed that more and more archetypes are getting those sort of continuous spells that benefit from your opponent just doing things like summoning monsters. You could technically even like extend that to a card like Promethean Princess, right? Where like literally your opponent special summons and it just allows itself to come back. That's a little bit crazy. So that's another thing. And then finally, the like sort of cap all bit of this discussion is the cheat. The cheat is something I've actually made a video about before, but basically it's how like certain cards quite literally just cheat mechanics. They'll just operate in ways where they kind of counterplay existing hand traps and stuff like that. So this is where that wanted example comes up. Normally, playing around Droll and Lockbird is something that you can consciously do by like ordering your searches and cutting down on like, inefficient searches. But with Wanted, you can use Wanted to search in your draw phase or your standby phase when your opponent cannot activate Droll and Lockbird on it. Another example I always bring up is like Low of the Voiceless Voice. So basically, Low, on summon gets a Voiceless Voice card, but it doesn't add it to your hand, it just places it directly on the field. And by placing it directly on the field, it means that a card like Ash Blossom simply can't work. Like you just can't use Ash on Low's effect. So it's still getting all the benefits of adding a card from your deck to your hand, but it's just, playing around an existing threat card like Ash Blossom. If you look deep enough, you can find a lot more examples of this in mini cards these days. Lots of decks are getting, inbuilt ways of dealing with Nibiru, ways where they can dodge infinite impermanence, and it's just kind of becoming more and more common. Now, with all that being said, do I think that this is all like a bad thing? Because it might sound like, oh, great, Paul's bitching about Yu-Gi-Oh! Again. And maybe I am, but I would actually argue that in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Some of this stuff just kind of had to naturally happen in order to keep up with like the pace of the game. Like the thing that I keep bringing up is that going second in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is really hard, and you kind of have to just rely on drawing out of engine hand traps or maybe board breakers when you go second or something to hopefully survive. But by giving yourself a way to play during your opponent's turn, like with a Rescue Ace Impulse or, any of those cards that can just like activate in your opponent's turn, a Bestial or something, then you are giving, players a way to like interact more. And Wanted being a quick play spell means that there is more sort of skill expression in how you activate it. A normal player might just sort of use it in the main phase and then get drolled for it, whereas a more keen player might use it in the draw phase and then they can benefit from that. So there's certainly not, just entirely like downsides to this. It doesn't just make the game worse. I think that it certainly makes the game feel a little bit like more layered, but it does sometimes make you worry because all of these elements that I'm talking about are mostly present in newer decks. And so decks that came out kind of before like 2022 or so don't really have it. So if you're trying to just squeak by with, a lower tier deck from years past, you won't have access to a card that you can just like play in your hand in the opponent's turn or the super hyper recursive resource engine. And so yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm not. I'm kind of interested in what people have to say about this. Have you guys like felt the effects of the power creep? How do you feel about it? Like, are you just you like kind of just follow the trends? You play new decks and you get to sort of benefit from this power creep. Do you think it's not even really power creep at all? I feel like it's only really noticed when you zoom out and just look at it all collectively. I'm just noticing more and more decks having these cards that recur in some way, activating the opponent's hand some way, whatever. So yeah, I would love to hear people's opinions on this down in the comments. If you think it's like a good thing, a bad thing, maybe what even type of power creep comes next. Who knows? All right, cool. Well, that's going to be it. Gone on long enough. I'll see you guys in the next one. Best turn.